The alarm tore through my sleep before my eyes even opened. I rolled out of the bunk and hit the deck running, still pulling my jacket over my shoulder as I moved. Red light pulsed along the corridor walls of the Solace, timed to the low pulse of the warning tone. 3 years on this ship and I still felt my heart jump every time that sound went off, no matter how many drills we had run. My name is Nathan Cole. I am the captain of the Solace, a single patrol ship stationed at the edge of a stretch of space called the Kestrel Drift. It is not a place anyone wants to be assigned. It is quiet, cold, and far from home. Most nights nothing happens at all. Tonight was not most nights. I reached the bridge in under a minute. Grace Holloway was already at the comm station, her fingers moving fast across the console, her face lit blue by the display in front of her. "Report," I said, dropping into the captain's chair. "Long-range sensors picked up a disturbance 8 minutes ago," Grace said, without looking up. At first, I thought it was a sensor glitch. It wasn't. "What kind of disturbance?" "Gravitic distortion. Big one. The kind you get when a large number of ships drop out of faster-than-light travel at once." I felt my stomach tighten. A single ship dropping out of faster-than-light travel makes a small ripple. A fleet makes a wave. "How many ships?" I asked. "I don't know yet," Grace said. "The distortion was too large to count individual signatures. Could be 5, could be 50. Ethan Marsh, my weapons officer, turned from his station. He was young, barely 30, but steady in a way that made people trust him fast. "Captain, if it's 50, there is nothing we can do here. We should fall back to the relay station and call for support." "We are the support," I said. "There is nobody behind us for 6 days at full burn. Whatever this is, we are what stands between it and the relay station." The Solace was not a large ship. She carried a crew of 11, a set of aging but well-maintained weapon systems, and a hull that had been patched more times than any of us could count. She was not built to fight a fleet. She was built to patrol empty space and report back if anyone dared to cross a line. That was the job. Nobody had ever expected the job to become more than that. "Laura, bring us to the edge of the disturbance," I said, slow and quiet. "I want eyes on this before we decide anything." Laura Bennett, our pilot, gave a short nod and began working the controls. The Solace turned, engines humming beneath the deck plating, and we moved toward the place where space itself had been bent and broken by the arrival of something large. I stood and walked to the main viewport at the front of the bridge. Outside, the stars sat still and silent, uncaring about what was happening around them. Somewhere out there, in the dark beyond our sensors, something had just arrived, something big enough to shake the fabric of space when it dropped out of faster-than-light travel. I did not know yet what it was. Part of me already suspected the answer, and that part of me did not like it one bit. "Talk to me, Grace," I said. "Anything on the emergency channels? Any distress calls? Any chatter?" "Nothing yet," she said. "Whoever they are not talking, not on any frequency we can hear." That silence bothered me more than noise would have. In my experience, most fleets announce themselves one way or another, even if only to warn everyone else to stay away. Silence from something that large usually meant one of two things. Either they did not care who heard them, or they were being very careful about who did. "Peter, how are the engines?" I asked, glancing toward my engineer. Peter Dunn had been with the Solace longer than anyone else on board, longer even than me. He had a way of speaking that made even bad news sound calm and manageable. "Engines are steady, Captain. We can hold full power for as long as you need. Shields are at 90%, and I can push that higher if you give me 10 minutes. "Take the 10 minutes, I said. "I have a feeling we might need everything you can give us." The bridge fell into a kind of working quiet, the sound of fingers on consoles and the low hum of the ship carrying us forward. I sat back down in my chair and tried to steady my breathing. Command is mostly about looking calm, even when your own mind is racing, and mine was racing hard. 6 years ago I had transferred to Border Patrol duty after a posting closer to the core worlds. Back then, the Kestrel Drift had a reputation as a dead-end assignment, a place career officers were sent when nobody wanted to deal with them directly, or a place quiet types like me asked to go because we liked the silence. Neither reason mattered much once you were actually out here. Out here, distance did the deciding for you. Out here, if something went wrong, there was no cavalry riding in to save the day. There was only the ship you had, and the people standing beside you. "Captain," Grace said suddenly, her voice sharper now, "I have a partial return, multiple contacts. I am reading at least 20 individual signatures, and the pattern suggests there could be more hidden behind the lead formation. 20 ships." My jaw tightened. 20 ships was not a patrol. 20 ships was not a scouting party. 20 ships was an invasion force, or close enough to one that the difference did not matter to the crew standing on a single vessel that would soon be the only thing standing in their path. "Classification?" I asked. "Working on it," Grace said. "The hull shapes do not match anything in our standard database, but the way they are arranged, the spacing between them, the formation discipline, that is military. Whoever built these ships trained their crews the same way we train ours. This is not a random gathering. This is a fleet that knows how to move together." I thought about the relay station 6 days behind us, filled with civilians who had chosen to live and work on the edge of known space because it paid well and the view of the stars was worth the risk. I thought about the small colonies scattered further back along the supply lines, places with names most people back home had never heard of, places that existed because someone decided it was worth the gamble to build a life out here, in the quiet dark. If this fleet was hostile, and if it got past us, none of those places would have any warning at all. "Options," I said, looking around the bridge at my crew. Ethan spoke first. "We could retreat and shadow them from a distance, gathering intelligence and relaying it back home. That keeps us alive and gives command time to prepare a real defense." "That takes 6 days to reach anyone who could act on it," Laura said quietly. "If this fleet keeps moving at any reasonable speed, they could be at the relay station before that message even arrives." "Then we hold position," I said. "We do not run. We do not shadow them from a distance and hope for the best. We put ourselves exactly where they can see us, and we make them decide what to do about it." Nobody argued with me, though I could see the tension in every face on that bridge. 11 people, one small aging warship, standing in front of a fleet that outnumbered us by a factor we could not yet even measure. It was not the kind of odds anyone wants to face, but it was the job, and every one of them had signed up for it knowing that someday the job might ask exactly this of them. "Grace, the moment you get a clean visual, I want to see it," I said. "Working on it now," she answered. Enhancing the sensor feed. The seconds stretched out longer than seconds should. I watched the main display, waiting for the fuzzy cluster of unknown signatures to resolve into something clearer, something I could actually plan against. My hands, resting on the arms of the captain's chair, were steady. My mind was anything but. "There," Grace said, and the image sharpened. The ships were long and dark, with hulls that curved in ways that reminded me of something grown rather than built, smooth ridges running along their length, like the spine of some deep-sea creature. They moved in a formation so precise it looked almost unnatural, each ship holding an exact distance from the ones around it, 20 confirmed vessels and, based on the gravitic readings, likely more waiting further back that our sensors had not yet resolved. "Do we have a match in the historical database?" I asked. "Any species we have encountered before with this hull design?" Grace shook her head slowly. "Nothing exact. There are some old survey notes mentioning a species along the far trade routes with a similar hull style, something called the Vein, but there is almost no data. A handful of merchant reports. Nothing official, nothing confirmed." "The Vein," I repeated. The name meant nothing to me, and that bothered me more than if it had meant something terrible. An unknown enemy is worse than a known one, because you cannot plan for what you do not understand. "Captain," Laura said from the pilot's seat, "we are approaching visual range. If they have sensors anywhere near ours, they already know we are here." I looked at the formation on the display, 20 dark ships moving in perfect silence through the void, and felt the full weight of what we were about to do settle onto my shoulders. There was no clever trick waiting in my back pocket, no secret weapon, no last-minute reinforcement arriving to save the day. There was just the Solace, her crew, and whatever came next. "Bring us to a full stop at the edge of visual range," I said, keeping my voice level even though my pulse was hammering. "Power up defensive systems, but do not arm weapons yet. I do not want to give them a reason to strike first." "Understood," Ethan said, his hands already moving across his console. "Grace, once we are in range, open a hailing channel on every frequency you can manage. Let them know we see them, and let them know we are not running." "On it," she said. The Solace slowed, her engines quieting from a steady roar to a low hum, until we drifted to a stop at the very edge of where our sensors could paint a clear picture of the fleet ahead of us. 20 ships, possibly more behind them. Against one small patrol vessel with a crew of 11, and a hull held together by good maintenance and a fair amount of stubbornness, I stood from my chair and walked to the viewport again, staring out at the darkness where those ships waited, close enough now that a few faint points of light marked their positions against the black. "Whatever happens next," I said quietly, mostly to myself, "we do not run." Behind me, I heard Grace finish setting up the hailing channel, and I heard Peter confirm shields at full power, and I heard Ethan report that weapons were ready to arm the instant I gave the order. 11 people, doing their jobs, trusting that I would find some way through this that did not end with all of us becoming a footnote in a report nobody back home would ever read. I did not know yet that the fleet ahead of us was about to make a decision that had nothing to do with our weapons, or our shields, or the small size of our ship. I did not know that somewhere in their own command structure, on one of those 20 dark vessels, something was already happening that had nothing to do with tactics and everything to do with memory. All I knew, standing there in front of that viewport with the whole crew of the Solace behind me, was that we had reached the edge of something, and there was no way to know what waited on the other side of it except to keep moving forward. "Captain," Grace said softly, "channel is open, whenever you are ready." I took a breath, turned back toward my chair, and prepared to speak to whatever was waiting out there in the dark. I opened the channel and spoke in the calmest voice I could manage. "This is Captain Nathan Cole of the human vessel Solace. You have entered a monitored sector. State your intentions." For a long moment, nothing answered. The silence stretched out across the bridge, broken only by the quiet hum of the ship's systems and the soft beeping of Grace's console as it continued scanning for any response. "Nothing yet," Grace said. "Signal was sent clean. They received it." "Try again," I said. "Different frequency." She adjusted the settings and repeated the hail. Still nothing. The fleet ahead of us did not move, did not respond, did not so much as adjust course by a single degree. 20 dark ships sat in the void, holding their formation, watching us the same way we were watching them. "Captain," Ethan said, "their formation is shifting." I turned toward the display just in time to see it happen. The 20 ships began to spread apart, widening their spacing, the outer vessels drifting to the sides in a slow and deliberate motion. It looked less like a random adjustment and more like the opening move of something rehearsed, something they had trained to do 100 times before. "That is not a retreat formation," Ethan said quietly. "That is an encirclement pattern. They are trying to get around us." My hands tightened on the arms of my chair. "Laura, keep us facing the lead ship. I do not want our back exposed to any part of that formation." "Copy that," Laura said, adjusting our heading with small, careful movements. "Grace, try the hail one more time. Tell them exactly what we are, and tell them we are not moving from this position." She nodded and opened the channel again. "This is the human vessel Solace, repeating our previous transmission. We hold this position under the authority of our government. We request identification and intention." Again, silence answered us, but this time, something changed. On the sensor display, one of the ships near the center of the formation began to slow, falling slightly behind the others, as though something on board had interrupted its course. "Captain, I am picking up something odd," Grace said, frowning at her console. "Internal chatter, very faint, leaking through what looks like an open channel on one of their ships. I do not think they meant for it to broadcast this far, but I am catching fragments. Can you translate it? I asked. Working on it. Our translation systems were not built for this language, but I am running comparisons against every database we carry. Give me a minute. A minute felt like a very long time, with 20 ships spreading out around us like a slow closing hand. But I forced myself to wait, to trust that Grace would find something useful in the noise. Around the bridge, the rest of the crew held their positions, eyes locked on their consoles, waiting for either an answer or an attack, and not knowing which would come first. I have partial translation, Grace finally said. It is rough, but I think I have enough. Someone on that ship said a word, repeated several times, and then a whole section of their crew went quiet. The word does not translate cleanly, but the closest match in our database is something like designation, or perhaps class marker. I think they are talking about our ship, not about us as individuals. Our ship specifically? I asked. Not humans in general? That is my read, Grace said. The chatter changed the moment someone identified the hull design or the name markings on our exterior. Before that, the tone sounded standard, procedural, like they were following a script. After that, it changed completely. I looked out at the fleet again, at the ships still slowly spreading into their encirclement pattern, though I noticed now that the movement had slowed, become less certain, as though whatever had happened on that one ship was spreading through the others as well. Peter, status on our engines and shields, I said. All steady, Captain. We can hold this position as long as you need. Ethan, are they arming weapons? He checked his readouts carefully before answering. No sign of weapon charge on any of their visible ships. Their energy signatures are steady, no spikes, nothing that looks like preparation to fire. That was strange. A fleet outnumbering us this badly, spreading into an encirclement formation, should have been preparing to strike, not holding steady with no weapons charge at all. Something about our presence had changed their behavior, and I did not yet understand what. Grace, keep monitoring that internal channel, I said. I want to know everything they are saying, even the parts that do not make sense yet. Already on it, she said, her fingers moving quickly. The Solace held her position, engines quiet, shield steady, facing a fleet that had stopped moving forward and seemed, for reasons none of us understood, to be arguing among itself. I stood at the viewport and studied the dark shapes ahead of us, 20 ships built by hands and minds we had never encountered before tonight, and I wondered what it was about one small human patrol vessel that had made them hesitate. Captain, I have more, Grace said after several tense minutes. There is a voice on that same channel, different from before, calmer, more controlled. I think it might be someone in command. The translation is still rough, but I believe they are asking for confirmation. They keep repeating a phrase that our systems translate loosely as, "Is this the ship, or is this truly the ship?" The ship, I repeated. Not a ship, the ship. That is how it reads, Grace confirmed. I felt a chill settle over me that had nothing to do with the temperature on the bridge. Somewhere in the history of this region of space, something had happened involving a ship like ours, something significant enough that an entire alien fleet would recognize the name or the hull design on sight and respond not with aggression, but with hesitation bordering on something close to fear. Do we have any record of prior contact out here? I asked, looking toward Grace and then toward the rest of the bridge crew. Any history of human vessels operating in this sector before the Solace was assigned here? I can check the archives, Grace said, but that will take time, and I do not want to pull my attention away from their communications while something is actually happening. Peter, can you dig through the ship's historical logs? Anything about previous vessels that carried this name or operated in this region? On it, Captain, Peter said, already redirecting one of his secondary consoles to the task. While he worked, the fleet ahead of us continued its strange, hesitant dance. Ships that had begun to spread wide into an encircling formation now drifted uncertainly, some holding position, others slowly easing back toward the center of the formation as though their commanders could not decide whether to continue the maneuver or abandon it entirely. "Captain," Ethan said, "one of their ships just broke formation entirely. It is moving away from the others, back toward the rear of the fleet." "Running?" I asked. "Possibly. Or repositioning. Hard to say without more data." I watched the display, tracking the single ship as it peeled away from its companions and drifted back into the darkness behind the main formation. Whatever was happening among that alien crew, it was significant enough to break their discipline, and disciplined fleets do not break formation without a serious reason. "Grace, anything new from the internal channel?" She held up a hand, listening intently to something coming through her earpiece, her expression shifting from concentration to something closer to shock. "Captain, I think I finally understand what they are talking about," she said slowly. "The name they keep repeating, the one that started all of this, it is not a designation for a type of ship or a class of vessel. It is a name, a specific name, and I think it might be the name our ship currently carries." "The Solace," I said quietly. "The Solace," she confirmed. "Captain, I do not think this is the first time a ship called the Solace has been seen in this part of space. I think there was another one, a long time before ours, and I think whatever happened to it is the reason this entire fleet just stopped in its tracks." I stood in silence for a moment, absorbing what she had told me, while around the bridge the rest of my crew exchanged glances, each of them trying to make sense of the same strange truth. Our ship, the small aging patrol vessel that had spent years quietly watching an empty stretch of space, carried a name that meant something to an alien fleet powerful enough to bring 20 ships or more into this sector, and that meaning had been enough to stop them cold. "Peter, anything in the historical logs?" I asked, my voice tighter now than I intended. "Still searching, Captain. Our own records only go back to when the Solace was commissioned 5 years ago. If there was a ship before ours carrying this name, the information is not in anything I have access to on board." "Then we need it from them," I said, turning back toward Grace. "Open the channel again. Direct hail, not a broadcast. I want to speak to whoever is in command of that fleet, and I want to know exactly what they think they know about us." Grace's hands moved quickly across her console, adjusting frequencies, narrowing the beam of our transmission until it aimed directly at the largest of the visible ships, the one positioned at the exact center of the loose and uncertain formation ahead of us. "Channel open," she said. "Whenever you are ready, Captain." I straightened in my chair, took a slow breath, and spoke into the silence of the void, aware that whatever answer came back might change everything I thought I understood about the small ship beneath my feet and the crew who had trusted their lives to it. "This is Captain Nathan Cole of the Solace," I said. "I believe there has been some confusion about our identity. I am requesting direct contact with your commanding officer. We are prepared to listen." The response, when it came, was not what I expected. A voice crackled through the speakers, distorted by translation software, struggling to keep pace with an unfamiliar language, but clear enough in its meaning that every person on the bridge understood it at the same time. "The Solace," the voice repeated, low and uncertain, carrying a weight that no simple ship designation should have been able to carry. "It has returned." Nobody on the bridge spoke, nobody moved. Outside the viewport, the 20 ships of the alien fleet hung motionless in the dark, and somewhere among them, a voice that had just called our ship a name, filled with old meaning, waited for whatever we would say next. "It has returned," the voice said again, and this time I heard something underneath the distortion of the translation software, something that sounded almost like disbelief. "I do not understand what you mean by that," I said, keeping my voice steady even as my mind raced through every possible explanation. "This ship, the Solace, was commissioned 5 years ago. It has never operated outside this sector. Whatever you believe you are seeing, I ask that you explain it to me clearly." There was a long pause before the voice answered again. "You do not know," it said, and the tone shifted, becoming less guarded, almost curious. You truly do not know what that name means to us. I do not, I admitted, but I would like to. Another pause, longer this time, as though the speaker on the other end was consulting with someone beside them, or perhaps deciding how much to reveal to a stranger who had wandered unknowingly into old history. My name is Cyril, the voice finally said, the translation software rendering it as close as it could to something pronounceable in our own language. I hold command of this fleet. What I am about to tell you is not something my people share easily with outsiders, but I believe you deserve to understand why 20 ships stopped moving the moment they read the marking on your hull. I am listening, I said. 3 generations ago, by your measure of time, Cyril began, there was a conflict along the border regions far beyond where you are standing now. It was not a war between our people and yours. It was a war between our people and another, a species we no longer speak of by name, one that sought to claim territory that did not belong to them. That war lasted many years, and it cost us more than I can easily describe. I glanced at Grace, who was recording every word, and at Ethan, whose hand had drifted near his console but not touched it, as though even he understood this was not the moment for weapons. During the final year of that conflict, Cyril continued, a single vessel arrived in the region, uninvited, unaffiliated with either side. It carried the name Solus, marked clearly on its hull, much as yours does now. At first, we believed it to be a scout for the enemy, or perhaps a neutral party seeking only to observe. We were wrong on both counts. What was it? I asked. A human vessel, Cyril said, much like your own, though larger and far older by the time it reached us. It had been damaged in some earlier conflict of its own, one we never fully understood, and it was searching, we believe, for a place to make repairs, or perhaps simply for a quiet corner of space to rest. Instead, it found itself caught between 2 fleets, locked in a struggle it had no part in. I felt the weight of what was coming before Cyril said another word. Somewhere in the history of a war, fought generations before I was born, a ship carrying the same name as mine had stumbled into a conflict that was not its own, and something about what happened next had left a mark deep enough to still be remembered. The enemy fleet, Cyril said, attempted to claim the human vessel as a prize, believing it too damaged to resist and too valuable to destroy. They surrounded it, cut off its escape routes, and demanded its surrender. We watched this happen from a distance, uncertain whether to intervene, uncertain whether the vessel was even capable of defending itself. What did it do? I asked quietly. It refused to surrender, Cyril said. For 3 days, by your measure of time, that single human vessel held its position against a force many times its size. It did not attempt to flee. It did not call for help that never would have arrived in time. It simply held its ground, and every time the enemy fleet attempted to close the distance and force a surrender, the vessel responded with such precision and such determination that the enemy began to lose ships faster than they had anticipated losing anything against a single crippled vessel. I sat very still, listening, aware that every person on my bridge was doing the same, caught up in a story none of us had known existed until this very moment. By the end of the 3rd day, Cyril continued, the enemy fleet had lost enough ships that its commanders made the decision to withdraw rather than continue the engagement. The human vessel, badly damaged, drifting, barely holding together, remained in position until the enemy fleet had fully retreated from the region. Only then did it finally power down its weapons and allow itself to drift, as though it had been waiting the entire time simply to see the fight through to its end. What happened to the ship afterward? I asked. We do not know, Cyril admitted. Our own fleet moved to offer assistance once the enemy had withdrawn, but by the time we reached the location, the vessel was gone. Whether it repaired itself and departed under its own power, or whether something else occurred, we never learned. It simply vanished from the region, leaving behind only the story of what it had done, and the name marked on its hull for anyone who cared to look. I thought about that, about a ship so damaged it could barely hold together, refusing every opportunity to surrender or flee, choosing instead to stand its ground against overwhelming odds for 3 full days. And I felt something shift inside me, a kind of quiet pride mixed with a heavier sense of responsibility. That story spread through our people quickly, Cyril said. Within a single generation, it had become something more than history. It became a lesson, told to young officers in training, about the danger of underestimating a vessel simply because of its size or its condition. The name Solace became a kind of caution, a reminder that some of the smallest, most damaged-looking ships in the sky carry a will to fight that has nothing to do with their size. And now you have found another ship carrying that same name, I said. Yes, Cyril said. When our sensors first identified your hull markings, many among my crew believed we were facing a ghost, or perhaps a trap set by an enemy who had somehow recovered the vessel and repaired it to lure us into a similar confrontation. It took some time for cooler minds to consider a more reasonable explanation, that perhaps your people simply reused a name that held meaning to us without realizing its history. We did not know, I said honestly. The Solace was named by a naval committee back home, chosen from a list of words meant to sound peaceful and reassuring. Nobody involved in that decision had any knowledge of what happened out here generations ago. I believe you, Cyril said, and there was something almost gentle in the translated tone of the voice now. But you must understand, Captain Cole, that belief and behavior are not always connected in a fleet as large as mine. Many of the officers under my command grew up hearing that name spoken as a warning. Seeing it now, on a vessel standing alone against our combined strength, has affected them in ways that are difficult to simply reason away. I glanced around the bridge again, at Grace still recording every word, at Ethan watching the sensor readouts with a new kind of focus, at Laura keeping her hands steady on the controls, at Peter monitoring engines and shields with the same careful attention he always gave them. None of them said anything, but I could feel the shift in the air around us, the sense that we had stumbled into something far larger than a simple border patrol encounter. Commander Cyril, I said, I want to be clear with you. I did not come here seeking a confrontation, and I have no history to draw on beyond what you have just told me. My ship is small, my crew is limited, and if your fleet intends to move through this sector, there is very little we could do to stop you if that was truly your goal. And yet you did not retreat, Cyril said. You held your position, hailed us openly, and made no attempt to hide your presence or flee from a fleet you must have known outnumbered you badly. That is the job, I said simply. This sector is ours to watch, and I was not prepared to abandon it without at least understanding your intentions. There was a pause, and when Cyril spoke again, the tone had changed once more, quieter, more thoughtful. Perhaps that is why the story of your predecessor became what it did among my people, not because of the damage it inflicted, though that was considerable, but because of the choice it made when every reasonable path forward suggested surrender or flight. It chose neither. I did not respond immediately, letting the silence sit between us for a moment, aware that whatever I said next would matter more than I might fully understand. Commander Cyril, I finally said, I would like to understand what happens next. Your fleet has stopped its approach, and I do not believe that stop was based on any real assessment of the threat my single ship poses to 20 of yours. I believe it was based on a story, and I would like to know whether that story is going to determine what happens here today. The response did not come immediately, and in the silence that followed, I found myself wondering whether the answer would depend not on tactics or firepower or any of the calculations I had trained my entire career to make, but on something far harder to predict, the weight of a legend none of us on the Solace had ever known we carried until this very night. I cannot yet answer that question, Cyril finally said. There are voices among my command staff who believe we should withdraw entirely, treat this encounter as a warning, best left unexamined. There are others who believe the opposite, that we should press forward and prove to ourselves that the story of your predecessor was nothing more than an old exaggeration grown larger with each retelling. And what do you believe? I asked. I believe, Cyril said slowly, that a story does not need to be perfectly accurate to be useful. Even if your ship carries none of the strength that vessel once demonstrated, the fact that my own officers hesitated at the sight of a name tells me something important about the nature of caution and the value of respecting things we do not fully understand. I heard movement behind me and turned to see Ethan leaning slightly toward his console, his eyes fixed on a new set of readings. "Captain," he said quietly, "several of their ships are powering up defensive systems. Not weapons, but shields and engines. It looks like they are preparing to move, but I cannot tell in which direction." "Understood," I said, and turned my attention back to the open channel. "Commander Cyril, my weapons officer informs me that several of your vessels are powering additional systems. I would appreciate clarity on what that means before this situation becomes something neither of us intended." "A fair request," Cyril replied. "There are factions within my fleet who wish to test your ship directly, to determine through action rather than words whether the legend holds any truth. I am attempting to prevent that outcome, but I do not have absolute control over every vessel under my banner. Fleets as large as mine are rarely as unified as they appear from the outside." That was not the reassurance I had hoped for. I looked toward Laura, whose hands remained steady on the controls, and toward Peter, whose focus on the shield systems had sharpened considerably in the last few seconds. "Peter," I said, "give me everything you can on shields, right now." "Already pushing past 90%, he said. "I can get us to full capacity within 2 minutes if needed." "Do it," I said, then turned back to the open channel. "Commander Cyril, I do not want a confrontation between us, but if any vessel under your command moves against my ship, I will respond in whatever way necessary to protect my crew. I would ask that you make that clear to whoever is considering testing that old story firsthand." "I will relay your words," Cyril said, "though I cannot promise every officer will listen. There is a certain kind of confidence that comes from commanding a much larger force, Captain Cole, and it does not always leave room for caution, no matter how wise that caution might be." I felt the tension in the bridge thicken, every crew member locked into their stations, watching the fleet ahead of us with the kind of focus that comes only when everyone understands exactly how much is at stake. 20 ships, and somewhere among them, at least a few who wanted to see whether the legend attached to our ship's name held any truth at all. "Grace," I said quietly, "keep monitoring their internal channels. I want to know the moment anything changes." "On it," she said, already adjusting her console. Minutes passed in tense silence, the fleet ahead of us holding position, some ships drifting slightly out of formation as though uncertain whether to advance or withdraw, the entire scene feeling less like a military standoff and more like a room full of people arguing quietly among themselves while trying not to let the argument show. "Captain," Grace finally said, "I am picking up something. One of the ships, not the lead vessel, is moving independently. It looks like it is breaking away from the formation entirely, heading in our direction." "Alone?" I asked. "Alone," she confirmed. "No support, no escort. Just one ship, moving toward us at a moderate speed." "Ethan, what can you tell me about that ship?" He studied his readouts for a moment before answering. "Smaller than the others, Captain. Looks like some kind of fast attack vessel, built for speed and precision rather than sustained combat. If this is a test, it is not meant to be a serious one. More like someone trying to provoke a reaction without risking too much in the process." "Commander Cyril," I said into the open channel, "one of your ships has broken formation and is approaching my position independently. I would like an explanation." The pause before Cyril answered was longer than any that had come before, and when the voice finally returned, there was a tightness in it that had not been present earlier. "That is Officer Talvin, one of my subordinate commanders. He has chosen to act without my authorization. I am attempting to recall him, but he is not currently responding to my orders." "Then I suggest you try harder," I said, my voice sharper than I intended, though not by much. "Because if that ship continues approaching my position in a way that threatens my crew, I will treat it as a hostile act, regardless of whatever internal disagreements are happening within your command structure." "I understand," Cyril said. "Please, Captain Cole, Give me a moment to resolve this internally before you take any action." I watched the small, fast attack vessel on the display, closing the distance steadily, moving with a confidence that suggested its commander believed he had already made up his mind about what he intended to prove. Around me, the bridge crew held their positions, waiting for my next order, trusting that I would find the right moment to act. "Ethan," I said, "target that vessel, but do not fire. I want to be ready if this becomes something more than posturing." "Targeting now," he said, his hands moving with practiced precision across the console. "Locked." "Laura, keep us steady. I do not want to give the appearance of retreating, not even slightly." "Holding position," she confirmed. The approaching ship continued to close the distance, and I felt the weight of the decision ahead of me settle heavily across my shoulders. Firing first would confirm every fear that fleet held about the legend attached to our name, but it would also mean striking the first blow in a conflict I had no desire to start. Waiting too long, on the other hand, risked allowing that single ship to close the distance enough to cause real damage before we could respond. "Commander Cyril," I said again, my voice as level as I could make it, "your officer has 30 seconds to reverse course before I consider this a direct threat to my ship and respond accordingly." "I am relaying that now," Cyril said, urgency creeping into the translated tone. "Please, hold your position. I do not wish for this to become something neither of us can undo." The seconds ticked by, the approaching vessel showing no sign of slowing, and I felt every person on the bridge tense further with each passing moment. Grace's hands hovered over her console, ready to relay any change in the situation the instant it happened. Ethan's focus remained locked on his targeting systems, waiting for either a stand-down order or a command to fire. Laura kept the Solace perfectly steady, refusing to give even the smallest impression of retreat. Peter monitored the shields, ready to redirect power wherever it was needed most. 15 seconds, I said quietly, watching the display. "Talvin, stand down," Cyril's voice came through the channel, no longer directed at me but relayed in full, the translation software catching both sides of an argument happening between two alien commanders in real time. "This is not the confrontation you believe it to be. Stand down immediately." The approaching vessel did not slow. 10 seconds, I said. I thought in that moment about the story Cyril had told us, about a damaged human vessel generations ago that had refused to surrender against odds far worse than the ones we faced now, that had held its position for 3 full days rather than give an inch to an enemy convinced of its own superiority. I thought about what it would mean if the first ship to test that legend in a new generation was met not with strength, but with hesitation. 5 seconds, I said, and looked toward Ethan. On my mark. The small vessel continued its approach, closing the final distance, and for one long, breathless moment, I believed we were about to find out exactly how far this confrontation was going to go. Then, at the very edge of what I would have considered too late, the ship's engines flared bright, and it began to slow, curving away from its approach vector, decelerating hard enough that I could see the strain of the maneuver even from a distance. "It is turning," Laura said, relief clear in her voice. "Captain, it is turning away." I let out a breath I had not realized I was holding. "Ethan, hold fire. Do not lock weapons any tighter than they already are. But do not release the target lock either. I want to be certain this is not a delay tactic." "Copy that," Ethan said, though I could hear the same relief in his voice that Laura had shown. "Commander Cyril," I said into the open channel, "your officer has reversed course. I would like an explanation for what just happened, and I would like assurance that this will not happen again." "Officer Talvin has been recalled and will face consequence for his actions once this encounter concludes," Cyril said, and there was something in the tone now that sounded almost like exhaustion, the weight of managing a fleet divided against itself finally showing through the translation software. "I apologize for the disruption, Captain Cole. Not every officer under my command shares my caution, and some believe that testing your resolve directly would settle the question of the legend once and for all." "And has it?" I asked. "Has anything been settled?" There was a long pause before Cyril answered, and when the response finally came, it carried a weight I had not expected. "I believe it has settled a great deal, Captain Cole. Your ship did not fire first, despite significant provocation. It did not retreat, despite being vastly outnumbered. It held its position with a discipline that matched, if not exceeded, the story we have carried about your kind for 3 generations. Whatever doubts remained among my officers about whether that story held any truth, I do not believe those doubts will survive what they have just witnessed." I looked around the bridge at my crew, at the tension slowly draining from their shoulders, replaced by a kind of quiet exhaustion that comes only after a moment of genuine danger has passed without disaster. Grace was still monitoring the channels, Ethan still watching his targeting systems, Laura still holding the ship steady, Peter still managing the shields, but the sharp edge of fear that had gripped all of us moments earlier had begun, slowly, to ease. "Commander Cyril," I said, "I would like to know what happens next. Your fleet came into this sector for a reason, and I still do not know what that reason is." "That," Cyril said, "is a conversation I believe we should have carefully, and with full honesty on both sides. But first, I believe my fleet requires a moment to reconsider exactly what it is facing here today, and I suspect, Captain Cole, that you and your crew deserve the same moment to catch your breath." I allowed myself a small, tired smile, the first since the alarm had woken me from sleep what felt like a lifetime ago, though the chronometer on the bridge insisted it had been less than an hour. "I think my crew would appreciate that, Commander, very much." We held position for the better part of an hour while both sides settled. I ordered Ethan to keep systems ready, but told him to ease the targeting lock on the fleet, a small gesture of trust that I hoped would be read the right way. Grace kept monitoring the open channel, and slowly, the chatter between alien vessels grew calmer, less charged, the kind of tone that suggested officers standing down from a state of high alert rather than preparing for further conflict. When Cyril's voice returned, it carried a different weight than before, less guarded, closer to something I might have called relief. "Captain Cole," Cyril said, "I believe it is time I explained why my fleet entered this sector in the first place. It has little to do with your ship, and everything to do with a situation my people have been trying to manage for several months." "I am listening," I said. "There is a group operating along the far edge of this region," Cyril continued. "Raiders, though that word does not fully capture what they are. They have been attacking merchant convoys, striking colonies too small to defend themselves, and retreating before any organized response can reach them. We have been tracking their movements for weeks, and our intelligence suggested they were preparing to move through this exact sector, likely targeting the relay station your people maintain further along the supply route." I felt a chill at the mention of the relay station, the same place I had been thinking about since the moment this entire encounter began. "You came here to intercept them?" "Yes," Cyril said. "Our fleet was moving to establish a defensive position ahead of their expected route, hoping to either deter them from entering this sector at all, or to engage them directly if deterrence failed. We did not expect to encounter a human vessel already stationed here, and I will admit, the confusion caused by your ship's name delayed our preparations considerably." "You could have told us that from the start," I said, though there was no real anger in my voice, only tired curiosity. "Perhaps," Cyril admitted, "but you must understand, Captain Cole, the moment my sensors identified the marking on your hull, very little about that first hour proceeded according to any plan. I spent most of it managing the reactions of my own officers, rather than considering how best to explain our purpose to you." I glanced toward Grace, who gave a small nod, confirming that everything Cyril described matched patterns her own instruments had picked up earlier. Faint traces of other vessel signatures further out in the sector, ones we had not paid close attention to while focused entirely on the fleet in front of us. "If raiders are truly moving toward this sector," I said, "then we have a shared problem, Commander. My ship alone could do little against a force capable of overwhelming outposts and merchant convoys. If your fleet is here to intercept them, I would rather work alongside you than stand apart out of old caution." There was a pause, and I imagined Cyril considering the offer carefully, weighing it against whatever remained of the tension between our two forces. "That is a generous offer, Captain Cole, especially given how our encounter began. I accept, on behalf of my fleet, and I believe cooperation between our forces will serve both our peoples far better than the confusion of the last hour." Over the following days, the Solace worked alongside Sorel's fleet, sharing sensor data, coordinating patrol routes, and preparing defensive positions along the most likely paths the raiders were expected to take. It was strange, at first, working so closely with a fleet that had, only days earlier, been prepared to test the truth of an old legend attached to our ship's name. But strangeness fades quickly when there is real work to be done, and soon enough, the crew of the Solace found themselves trading information with alien officers as though the earlier tension had never happened at all. Gray spent long hours refining our translation systems, working alongside members of Sorel's communication staff to build a smoother, more reliable way for our two languages to bridge the distance between them. Ethan coordinated closely with their weapons officers, comparing tactics and technology, each side surprised by how much the other had figured out independently, arriving at similar solutions through very different paths. Laura worked with their navigators to plot patrol routes that covered the sector more efficiently than either fleet could have managed alone, and Peter spent time simply talking with their engineers, comparing notes on maintaining ships far from any proper shipyard, a challenge that apparently transcended species entirely. I spent much of that time speaking with Sorel directly, learning more about the history behind the legend that had so unexpectedly shaped our first encounter. The original Solace, the ship from generations past, had never been fully identified beyond its name and the story of its stand against overwhelming odds. No records existed of its origin, its crew, or its ultimate fate after it vanished from the region following that legendary three-day defense. It had simply appeared, done what it did, and disappeared again, leaving behind only a story that grew larger and more meaningful with each passing generation of retelling. "Do you think it was real?" I asked Sorel one evening, as our two fleets held position together along the edge of the sector, watching for any sign of the raiders' approach. "The story, I mean. Do you think it happened exactly the way it has been told?" "I have wondered that many times," Sorel admitted. "Stories change with each retelling. Details sharpen or soften depending on who tells them and why. But I believe something happened out here, something significant enough to leave a lasting mark on an entire fleet's collective memory. Whether every detail survived perfectly intact, I cannot say. But I do not believe the core of it was invented entirely from nothing." "And now there is a new story," I said. "One where a much smaller version of that same legend held its ground against your fleet, refused to fire first, despite provocation, and ended up working alongside you instead of against you." "Yes," Sorel said, and I could hear something like satisfaction in the translated tone. "I suspect that story will travel just as far as the last one, Captain Cole, though I hope this version encourages cooperation rather than caution." The raiders arrived 11 days after our fleets first joined forces, moving through the sector exactly as Sorel's intelligence had predicted, likely believing they would find nothing more than a quiet stretch of space and an unprepared relay station waiting to be plundered. Instead, they found a combined defensive line, human and alien ships, working together with a coordination that surprised even some of our own crew who had spent the previous days building that cooperation piece by piece. The engagement itself was brief. Faced with a defensive force far larger and more prepared than anything their intelligence had suggested, the raiders broke off their approach almost immediately, scattering in different directions rather than risk a confrontation they had no chance of winning. A handful of their smaller vessels were disabled and captured, their crews taken into custody for questioning, while the majority fled the sector entirely, likely searching for an easier target somewhere else along the frontier. When it was over, and the combined fleet had confirmed the sector clear of any remaining threat, Sorel opened a final channel to speak with me directly, away from the wider communications shared between our two forces. "Captain Cole," Sorel said, "I want to thank you, both for your patience during our first encounter and for your cooperation in the days since. I do not believe this outcome would have been possible if either of us had responded differently to that first tense hour. I think we were both fortunate, I said honestly. A little more provocation, a little less patience on either side, and this could have gone very differently. Perhaps, Sorel agreed, but I have come to believe that patience is its own kind of strength, Captain Cole, one that does not always receive the same recognition as raw firepower, but one that matters just as much, if not more, in situations exactly like the one we found ourselves in that day. I thought about that for a long moment, standing at the viewport of the Solace, watching the combined fleet begin to disperse, each vessel returning to its assigned patrol route now that the immediate threat had passed. 20 ships, and a legend generations old, had once stopped in silence at the sight of a name marked on a small human hull. Not out of fear of what that ship could do in the moment, but out of respect for what a ship carrying that name had once proven itself capable of, and perhaps, in some smaller way, out of respect for what our own small crew had proven itself capable of doing right here in this sector. Commander Cyril, I said, I would like to propose something before your fleet departs this region entirely. I am listening, Cyril said. A standing arrangement, I said, between your fleet and any human vessels assigned to this sector going forward. Shared intelligence, coordinated patrols, a direct line of communication in case either of our peoples encounters a threat neither of us could handle alone. I believe what happened here proves that cooperation serves both of us, far better than caution born from old stories. There was a pause, though a shorter one than before, and when Cyril answered, there was no hesitation left in the translated voice at all. I believe that is a wise proposal, Captain Cole, and one I intend to recommend strongly to my own command structure. Perhaps this encounter will be remembered differently than the one from generations past, not as a warning about the danger of underestimating a small ship, but as the beginning of an alliance built from exactly that same lesson. In the months that followed, that arrangement grew into something larger than either Cyril or I had expected that day, a working relationship between human patrol forces and Cyril's fleet that extended cooperation across several sectors of the frontier, each side learning from the other, each side growing stronger for having stood together rather than apart. I still think, sometimes, about that first hour, about the silence that fell over an entire alien fleet the moment their sensors read the name marked on our hull, about the strange weight carried by a word chosen by some naval committee back home who never imagined it held any history beyond sounding peaceful and reassuring. I think about how easily that silence could have turned into something far worse, how close we came to becoming nothing more than the second chapter in a legend that began generations before any of us on this crew were even born. But I think, too, about what that silence actually taught me, standing on the bridge of a small aging patrol vessel facing down a fleet that outnumbered us by a factor too large to comfortably measure. It taught me that reputation, once earned, carries further than anyone expects, reaching across generations and species alike, shaping decisions made by people who never met the ones who first earned it. It taught me that patience, held firmly in the face of overwhelming odds, can accomplish what firepower alone never could. And it taught me that sometimes the most important battles are the ones you win without ever firing a single shot, simply by refusing to give ground, and by proving, through action rather than legend, exactly what kind of crew stands behind the name marked on your hull. The Solace still patrols the Kestrel Drift today, her crew rotated over the years as postings change and people move on to new assignments, but the story of that first encounter travels with her regardless of who sits in the captain's chair. New officers hear it during their first briefing before reporting for duty out here, much the same way, I imagine, that young officers in Cyril's fleet once heard the story of a different Solace, generations before this one, standing alone against odds that should have ended in surrender. I do not know what happened to that first ship, the one whose stand against overwhelming force created a legend strong enough to stop 20 warships cold 3 generations later. I do not know if her crew ever understood what they had started that day, or if they simply did what they believed was right and moved on, unaware of the shadow their choice would cast, across so much space and so much time. But I know what our crew did, here, in this quiet corner of the frontier, when an entire fleet appeared out of nowhere, and every reasonable calculation suggested we should have turned and run. We held our position. We spoke honestly when the moment called for honesty. We refused to fire first, even when provoked, and we extended a hand toward cooperation the moment the opportunity presented itself. Perhaps that is the real lesson buried inside every version of this story, old and new alike. Not that a single ship can defeat an entire fleet through strength alone, because it cannot, and it never could, but that the choices made under the greatest pressure, the ones nobody back home will ever fully understand unless they were standing on that bridge themselves, are the ones that end up shaping history far beyond anything any of us expected when the alarm first tore through the silence of an ordinary night. The fleet fell silent that day, not because they feared what our weapons could do to them, but because they remembered what a ship like ours had once been willing to do rather than surrender. And in the end, that memory, carried across generations and species alike, became the foundation for something far stronger than fear ever could have built on its own.